Welcome to Crushing Comics, the show where I fall in love with my comic collection all over again. Let's go straight to the wall and pluck off something new. Oh my goodness, to be unwrapped. This feels absurdly large. I guess it must be a library edition or an absolute because it feels gigantic. They say when you move houses, you are the most susceptible to changing your brand allegiances. And so when people know that you have moved in somewhere new, that's why you get so much mail that talks about like coupons for toothpaste, toilet paper, cereal, whatever. It's not a welcome packet. It's not even just to get you to go to a supermarket. It's because they know you're susceptible to change. And I think that's a really interesting facet, not just of grocery buying, right? Like when you uproot yourself and move to a new place, or even when you do smaller uprooting, like you start a new job, how much are you willing to change your routine, and how much does that change go past what you're eating, right? Does it go into your exercise routine? Does it go into what you're reading? I know for me, as we've been in this travel process to come down to New Zealand, I've been reading a lot of DC this year. I really was off Marvel. I haven't been able to get into Marvel, new Marvel, since Secret War. It kind of just killed all of my enthusiasm. And in this process, I went through a period where I was reading a ton of indie stuff, and I just like could not really get into Marvel or DC. And then finally, kind of opened my eyes back to Marvel and started to be able to really appreciate post-Civil Secret War Marvel. And so I started catching up on books like Avengers and Inhumans and all the X-Men titles. So it's interesting that it's not just your toothpaste that you want to change when you move to a new place. Let's see what we've got in this massive... Oh, these are some really good books. I make these satisfied noises a lot. Hopefully it lets you know how much I really do love this collection. I looked a long damn time for these absolutes. They are Absolute Planetary, Volume 1 and 2. This is so good. This is one of those series that I would say to you, if you're a comic book fan and you've read an amount of comic books and you're looking for something different to read, buy these. Don't buy these absolutes. Probably the best way to do this right now is there's either 2 thick paperbacks or one really beautiful omnibus, and you should just get one of those and have it. They're not expensive. Read it. It's incredible. How did I come to know about Planetary? So it's written by Warren Ellis, and it is... Wow, they're so big you can even see them on camera here on my little side table. Written by Warren Ellis and entirely drawn by John Cassaday, and that's actually how I discovered them. I was reading Astonishing X-Men, which was coming out at a glacial pace, and this was before I was into this all collection here, and I was just like picking them up at Tower Records from the spinner rack, like, oh hey, some X-Men, great. And so I was maybe like halfway through Astonishing X-Men, and I was really into the John Cassaday art, and I was saying to myself, like, well, surely he's drawn something else. What else could I read with him? And he hadn't drawn a ton of Marvel. He had done some Captain America, who's not historically one of my absolute favorites to read, but I discovered that he had drawn this series called Planetary with Warren Ellis. I knew Warren Ellis primarily through some of his first Marvel work in the 90s, which was writing Excalibur, which was my favorite title. He wrote some terrific stuff for Nightcrawler and Kitty Pryde, and so I had an affinity for him. He also had written Doom 2099 and some other stuff for Marvel at the time, but I mostly know him as this Excalibur guy. I kind of dimly was aware that he had turned into one of these big auteurs of comic books because people had mentioned it to me in bookstores, like, oh, have I read XYZ series by him? But this was in the mid-2000s and I wasn't actively reading, so I didn't really have an understanding of who all the big authors were. Like, I didn't even know who Grant Morrison was at that point. So I was like, oh, I've heard of Ellis. I remember Ellis. Ellis and Cassaday sounds cool. I'm going to pick up this book. And it just, like, and I immediately started, but like I bought one trade paperback, and the next day I got the next trade paperback, and then I remember I had all 3, and I was like waiting for the 4th one, and I got the 4th one as soon as it came out. And this was before I had my big comic book collection. I was, maybe the 4th one came out once I started my bigger collection, but I just got addicted to this series, and I really attribute it to my more wide-ranging interest in comics when I came back to comics rather than just reading X-Men so rotely. That's how all this business happened, like all this indie stuff, because this opened my eyes to that. So here's how can I explain Planetary. It starts out with this kind of mysterious strong woman visiting this man who has powers over temperature or cold in some way in the middle of the desert and saying, we need you for a mission. And he's very old and very curmudgeonly, but he begrudgingly agrees to join her. And they investigate sort of this bombed out installation that used to be a headquarter of superheroes, like carved into a mountain. And we learn that they've defended effectively like an incursion from another galaxy or another dimension. But they also have this supercomputer that has realized the sum total of dimensionality available across all worlds. So this is pretty heady stuff, and you think you might be in for this big, like, oh, investigate the dimensions kind of story. But Ellis is doing a very specific, very fascinating thing here. Almost every single issue of Planetary is a different comic book or sci-fi trope. There's like a Korean revenge film one, there's a big movie monsters one, there's one that's effectively the villainous version of the Fantastic Four. Like, what if 4 heads of industry had gone to space, got these powers, came back, and decided not to do any good things with them? And Warren Ellis kind of just systematically deconstructs superhero trope after trope in, I want to say, 27 issues of this series. And John Cassaday draws everyone, and one of the really great, clever things about it is that every cover is different. They don't do any that look the same. There's no, like, normal cover treatment. Now, of course, Ellis is not known as the fastest of all writers, nor Cassaday the fastest of all artists. And so the time between chapters of this got longer and longer, which is why I was like really waiting for that last one. But I'll tell you, it is satisfying from beginning to end. It is incredible. It tells a story that really, really comes together. Here's an example of one cover, the Planetary magazine. So now I will find you another cover. It really is satisfying. Gosh, Cassaday's really at his best. He's really declined a little bit in more recent years, but his art just looks fantastic here. It's satisfying in the end. It has big shocks that you might not have thought could be built into a series like this that is so heavily serialized. So then here's this very different, almost looks like a 90s album cover. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it comes around and really thrills you. I will not spoil any of them, but they are big ones, and it's a series that invites you to read it again, because it's one of those great things where the revelations in the series are so interesting that they will cause you to read it again from a different viewpoint and appreciate it in a totally different way. I've read it at least twice all the way through, and I've read some portions of it on many, many occasions. It's one of my top recommendations. Much like Watchmen, I don't know if you could appreciate it fully if you have not read a lot of comic books and you just like comic book movies and comic book media. That's cool, and you are still a comic book fan, but I don't know if you will fully get this. But maybe you will. I bought it for a very good friend of mine that I used to work with, and I was like, I just think you're going to get it, because he loves sci-fi, and so I knew he would still get all the sci-fi tropes, and he said that he loved it. But I would say, if you've kind of like done your superhero thing, and you want to spread out a little bit, branch out, maybe you've read Watchmen, maybe it's like one of those things you're considering, it's time for you to appreciate Planetary, and I doubt you'll be disappointed. And Planetary also very briefly intersects with the DC universe, because it was part of Wildstorm, and Wildstorm was purchased by DC, and so they have the ability to kind of do that playing around, but it's non-official, and I don't believe it's in these absolutes. These absolutes are just the proper series. So I'm so happy to put them on my shelf. They were hard to track down at the time, and I am not planning on letting them go, because this is one of my favorite series, and I'm very happy to have it in multiple formats, because then I can lend the one format out and then keep this one safe on my bookshelf. So let's head to its ceremonial shelving. Gosh, where does this one belong? I guess this will be our little absolute area. Thanks so much for joining me. No X-Men today. My X-Men, it's like my Superman ripped open shirt, but there's an X-Men costume underneath. No X-Men today, though, but still one of my all-time favorites. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please join me again and again and again and again for however many of these books are left on the shelf for more episodes of Crushing Comics.